Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Derrick, back with you today for the final day of programming for Bentonville 156, a Carolinas Campaign virtual event. Today's programming focuses on the latter part of the battle and the battle's aftermath. Much has been written about the Battle of Bentonville, and rightly so. After all, nearly 80,000 soldiers were here, making it by far the largest battle ever fought in North Carolina. As Dr. Bradley discussed last night, it proved to be one of the last major battles of the entire Civil War and the last battle between the two principal Western Theater armies from both sides. Comparatively little, however, has been written about the battle's immediate aftermath. The clash resulted in roughly 4,200 casualties, making it also the bloodiest battle ever fought in the Tar Heel State. And you've heard this week about the medical care that the wounded received, and we'll hear more today about the Harper family, whose house has served as a field hospital during the battle. But today I'm going to kick things off really by focusing on the most unfortunate of the battle's casualties. What happened to the remains of the battle's dead? There were going to be great differences in the care that the dead from each side received. Because the Union Army controlled the field in the battle's aftermath, they were left with the grisly task of burying the dead from both sides. Their own were buried in marked graves for reinterment later. And here at Bentonville, most of the Federal dead were moved to Raleigh in 1867. The Confederates could not be identified by the Federals even if they had wanted to, and thus they were not given the same treatment, as dog tags did not exist. Not saying necessarily that the Federals really cared about moving the Confederates later. Thus, these Confederates were buried in unmarked graves, often where they fell, and sometimes individually, but more likely in 2s and 3s, 4s and 5s. Records are also just so much better on the Federal side, which makes sense with the impending collapse of the Confederacy. Thus, we know so much more about what happened to the remains of the Federal dead from Bentonville, leaving the Confederates more of a mystery. Thus, the title of my talk is A Monumental Mystery, the Battle of Bentonville's Lost Confederate Soldiers. Let's see if we can find out what happened to them. Pay special attention here to the Goldsboro Rifles monument. First photo taken in 1895, while the other is a modern day image after my title pops up. You'll be seeing both of these later in the presentation. As you can tell from this contemporary illustration, there's going to be much chaos and destruction left in the aftermath of any Civil War battle's wake, but let alone one that involved 80,000 soldiers in such a rural area. 80,000 men are going to leave their mark on a community. After securing their own wounded and preparing them for transport to Goldsboro, the primary task for the Federals was going to be to bury their own dead, once again, in marked cemeteries so that they can be reinterred elsewhere later if the federal government was to so choose. The remains of the Confederates were not as well looked after. They're going to be buried in 2s and 3s, 4s and 5s, wherever they fall on the battlefield. Even if the Federals had wanted to mark them, they would not be able to do so because there's no such thing as a dog tag or anything such as that. It's really going to be 30 years later before anyone is going to try to properly mark any Confederate dead here at Bentonville. At least in one case, in the battle's aftermath, Union artillerists marked one of these mass graves where Confederates fell. And according to them, they had fallen 6 deep. They put up a sign that read, "These men were killed by Battery C, 1st OVA," which is probably likely more of a brag than a true attempt at marking a Confederate cemetery. A perfect example of the chaos in the aftermath of a Civil War battle is exemplified by the experiences of the John and Amy Harper family. You can see a photo of John Harper here. Obviously, being behind Union lines, the Harper House, once it became a hospital, was a Union hospital. And roughly 600 wounded soldiers were treated at this hospital. But a number of these wounded treated at the Harper House were actually Confederate prisoners of war. We know of at least 54, because 54 are going to be left behind in the battle's aftermath. It is likely that there may have been more. Some of those guys were only receiving minor wounds and were able to march off as prisoners of war. But when the Union Army's ambulance wagons and their spent ammo, the ammunition wagons, all those are going to be full of Union wounded being transported to Goldsboro. So there's no way of transporting these Confederates, who are, many of them have suffered amputations. They are all received some sort of serious wound that prevented them from being able to march off as prisoners. Who are you going to leave behind? Well, of course, you're going to leave the enemy's wounded behind. And they do leave 54 of them in the care of the John and Amy Harper family. Now, according to John Harper, 23 of those 54 would die in the next weeks and months afterwards. And in fact, it's not going to be until summer before the last wounded Confederate is finally able to return home. They're going to care for them, burying, according to the family, 21 of those 23 near their own family cemetery, leaving the other two as locals being taken home for burial. Family sources also say one of those 21 was later reinterred elsewhere, leaving a total of 20. And here you can see more information about the Harper family. Feel free to pause this video if you ever want to read any of the text on the screen. Now, as for the Union wounded, once again, they're hauled off to Goldsboro. Some of those guys are going to die in the battle's aftermath at hospitals in places like Goldsboro and eventually New Bern. And those guys are going to be buried in what becomes New Bern National Cemetery. But the ones who are killed outright in Bentonville, especially the ones buried in the vicinity of the Harper farm, are going to be in a marked cemetery. 2 years later, the federal government is going to pay to have those guys moved to what is now Raleigh National Cemetery. And you can see a photo of that here, and a photo of specifically of John M. Knapp's grave marker. Knapp was killed on March 19th here at Bentonville. We have a letter written by a sergeant to his family. He was buried in a plum orchard. Mr. Harper had a plum orchard. But obviously, once again, they had to have been buried in marked graves because people knew where to go and find them to move them to Raleigh. The cemetery chosen in Raleigh was actually already a Confederate cemetery. It was on the grounds, or at least in the vicinity, of Pettigrew General Hospital off Rock Quarry Road. The citizens of Raleigh were ordered to reinter the Confederate dead to a new cemetery. The federal occupiers even threatened to have them dug up and thrown in the streets if the citizens didn't move them. And so in 1867, they were moved to what becomes Oakwood Cemetery, and Raleigh National Cemetery is established for the dead, principally from Bentonville, but also Avery'sboro, and also the sick, the soldiers who died of illness from Sherman's march. Now, the story goes that contractors who reinterred these guys were paid by the head. So there is legend saying that these guys are literally paid by the head, so they would only reinter a skull, which means that there could possibly still be Union remains at Bentonville and places like Avery'sboro and elsewhere. And you can see a photo of John M. Knapp here. Private Knapp. The letter that his sergeant sent to his family is here, and once again, feel free to pause and read that. And here is a photo of Oakwood Cemetery. The citizens of Raleigh moved over 500 dead there in 1867 alone. Some of these possibly were from Bentonville. The Confederates did evacuate some mortally wounded soldiers, though the bulk of the Confederates who were mortally wounded were left behind for the Federals. So some of these guys may have died in Confederate hospitals in the aftermath of the battle. And once they did die, they were buried there at Pettigrew and then later moved to Oakwood Cemetery. Though my guess is the bulk of those 500 dead were actually from other theaters of war and soldiers who had died of illness earlier in the war. So fast forward 30 years, so from 1865 to 1895, and we'll actually go back one year and say 1894. It's when the first serious effort is made to commemorate the Confederate dead and move them of Bentonville and move them to a dedicated cemetery. And it's the Goldsboro Rifles who take up the cause. And who are the Goldsboro Rifles? They are what we would call a National Guard unit now. They were members of the State Guard. They're a state militia unit. It's also a quasi-civil club, civic club, I should say. So many of the members of the Rifles may have thought it was the right thing to do to move these guys to a cemetery, but it also did not hurt the political aspirations of the Rifles' civic-minded officers. Commemorating Southern soldiers and the Confederate cause was a way to gain political capital for Democrats in an era that was dominated by Republicans and populists. It was also a way of uniting white voters in a common cause. The Rifles' use of their mouthpiece, the Goldsboro Daily Argus, and you can see the article here from the Argus. They would use that Argus to disparage Republicans and to raise money for the Bentonville Project. So what is the Bentonville Project? They're going to get volunteers to come over to Bentonville. And in the meantime, they're raising money to erect a monument that's going to be the area of a mass grave. But of course, I like to call the Rifles task Sisyphean. And by what I mean by that is that they have to find these Confederate dead on the battlefield 30 years after the fact. And according to the Argus, they only allotted 2 weeks and relied on volunteers for this grisly task. But the Harpers did donate land for a cemetery. And once again, this monument was commissioned for that area. And so when the weather finally cooperated, they picked March 20th, 1895, which is a pretty apt date as the 30th anniversary of the battle's second day, to hold a ceremony which is going to feature a sham battle. And they go and get keynote speaker General Wade Hampton, and we'll show his photo in just a moment. But I do want to quickly point out that that's John and Amy on the porch, and that's within 2 years of his death. By the time of this photo, John is already in his mid-90s, and you can see the Harper House is decorated. At least an attempt is made to decorate the Harper House or show the Harper House as a field hospital, commemorating that it had been during the battle. You can see the Red Cross flag flying on the porch. But as I'm sure many of you guys know already, the Red Cross did not exist during the Civil War. But by the 1890s, people associated that Red Cross with a military hospital. And so that's the reason it's flying there. And you can see General Hampton, and he's an apt choice because Hampton chose the battlefield for General Johnston in March of 1865. And of course, by the 1890s, he's a lost cause redeemer. He's avid on the speaker circuit. He was an apt choice. He spent, according to some sources, he spent the evening of March 18th or March 17th, 1865 at the Harper House, and he does stay the evening of March 19th, 1895, before the ceremony the next day. The monument itself, you see here in this next photo, claims that this is the final resting place of 360 Confederate soldiers and lists 42 names. And you can actually, if you peek really closely, you can see the Harper House back in the background. But keep in mind, monuments are not erected overnight. Even if they only allot 2 weeks for finding these guys, that information had to go up on the monument months before. That does not necessarily mean that what they're going to be able to find when they get to Bentonville is going to match perfectly with what's on the monument. Contemporary illustration from the time period, and you'll see it in just a moment, instead of what you would expect, a mound housing a mass grave, actually shows what looks like individual wooden head and foot markers. But over the years, the monument area, including those head and foot markers, were allowed to deteriorate. They're made of wood, after all, and they're going to rot. This area is farmed. They're going to plow as close to the cemetery as they possibly can to use as much land as they can. So once the markers were gone, there's nothing to commemorate that cemetery except for the monument itself. And you can see the monument was even not in great shape over the years. The first photo, the photo on the left taken in the 1920s, photo in the top right, 1930s, and then 1950s down at the bottom. And then even worse, after the state acquires Bentonville Battlefield State Historic Site and that monument area, in 1957. One of the first things that they tried to do was restore the Harper family cemetery. And since that area had been plowed, the fence with the cemetery had been allowed to, a berm had been created on the fence. They were trying to restore that by hand. And I know this firsthand because I did an oral history interview with the first site director here, who came here in the late 50s. And he said that they just happened to see a state motor grader riding down what is now our Harper House Road. And they decided that they should just flag the motor grader down and come smooth the area. He even told me that they lifted the Harper family cemetery grave markers and said that they tried to get the markers back as close as where they were, but they had the motor grader go over the entire area. So any remains of a cemetery, and you would actually be standing in this photo, you're standing very close to where the Goldsboro Rifles monument stands now, looking back towards the Harper family cemetery. So you're actually looking over where that Confederate cemetery or Confederate mass grave would have been. And so it could not be a great thing to have that area motor graded. So because of all that, people just took what's on the monument for the gospel. It says 360 Confederate soldiers are buried here. There must be a mass grave. And you can see the monument area taken an aerial photo taken in the 1970s, the monument down in the bottom left, where those pine trees have grown between the monument and the Harper family cemetery in the center of the photo. But finally, by the 2000s, serious questions about this purported mass grave were finally really being asked. Why does the monument claim 360 soldiers are buried here when Confederate soldiers claimed less than 250 were killed outright and left on the battlefield? Now, granted, yes, more than 360 Confederate soldiers died as a result of the Battle of Bentonville, but some of those people died at hospitals as far away as Charlotte. They were not going to be brought back behind federal lines for burial in 1865. It's just not going to happen. All right, next question. Several names listed on the monument could not be proven to have been soldiers at all. And then some of them lived long after the Civil War. Still others, like this guy, Captain Robert Rankin, are actually buried in their hometowns. Rankin is buried in Wilmington. I have seen his a newspaper account of his body returning to Wilmington in 1866. The same is true about this next guy, Richard Saffel of the 26th Tennessee. Saffel is allegedly buried in his native Knoxville, Tennessee. Rankin himself is really neat. This photo of Rankin is really neat. I searched long and hard for a photo of Rankin. He's wearing his Masonic apron, and so this is obviously a pre-war photo. And then first, and the most obvious question to me is, how are they going to find all these bodies 30 years later? I mean, that was a huge task. And I do want to show you Rankin's grave marker in Oakdale Cemetery in Wilmington, not to be confused with Oakwood in Raleigh. And here's Saffel's grave marker in Knoxville. Saffel's buried with his brother, who was killed in the Petersburg campaign. So what are we going to do? How are we going to find these answers? And of course, the only way to do it is archaeology. And you want to use the archaeological technique that's going to really cause the least disturbance, and that's going to be at least first ground penetrating radar. Just happened to be that the History Channel was filming a Save Our History special at the same time. They heard we were doing this work and decided to come and film the GPR survey while we were searching for evidence of this mass grave. Pulling the sled here was Steve Thomas from this old house. But the embarrassing thing, since it's going to be on national TV, was that the GPR survey found no evidence of a mass grave. Feedback did tend to indicate some possible individual graves between the Harper family cemetery and the Rifles Monument, but of course this is not nearly as exciting as a mass grave for a national TV audience. And yes, I know it sounds amazing, but the History Channel did at one point have history on it. Now, to corroborate these GPR findings, almost miraculously, an 1895 photograph of the monument was brought to our attention. This photo that I showed you on the first slide shows individual head and foot markers, which really probably should not be present for a mass grave. Quickly, before we move on, I can show you that photo. I do want to show you what the GPR shows. It actually goes through slices of ground. So these are individual segments of ground. Each one of these boxes is a layer deeper. Of course, this means very little to me. I'd like to call myself a historian, but I'm definitely not a scientist or archaeologist. But you can kind of see a close-up on one of these layers. And that red stuff that red stuff was what could be a cemetery. So here's the photo I've been mentioning, and I'll blow it up for you in just a second. But this photo is taken March 20th, 1895 by Parker Studios in Dunn, North Carolina. And so it's taken shortly after the dedication, or maybe even shortly before, we're not certain. But if you look to the left behind the monument, you can actually see those wooden markers, individual markers. Yes, it's a long row of disturbance, but there is no mound. And these markers roughly corroborate to what you would expect a head and a foot marker to look like. And I'll blow one of them up. And you can see that there. The white, looks like white picket fence there in the background. That is the Harper family cemetery. All right, so the GPR doesn't seem to show a mass grave, but it may show a cemetery. We're just not certain. So how do you find out in the next answer? The only way to find out more answers is going to be field work. And so site staff under the supervision of archaeologists dug down several inches deep at a time. And this work began back in 2007. Site staff dug 10 inches with the backhoe to get us started, and then we continued with shovels. Evidence of reburial features were found about 10 to 24 inches below the surface, and this really shows dark soil, which shows evidence of past disturbances. Nails were found, which gave evidence of wooden boxes, and these boxes were about 18 to 24 inches long, which incidentally sounds pretty accurate, because that's the size of the boxes that the Federals who were reinterred from Bentonville showed up in Raleigh. One lady who was particularly bitter about the cemetery being converted to now a Union cemetery said we were bested by the littlest Yankees, referring to those tiny boxes. Subsequent digging found evidence of bone fragments, and this kind of confirmed the graves. Digging thus ceased, and the bones were reburied. The soil disturbances boxes of bones matched the area indicated in the GPR map, and 8 sites were discovered in total in a line about 3 feet apart. Additional excavation in 2010 helped prove that there are at least 20 individual graves in the cemetery. This evidence is supported once again by Harper family records and that newly discovered photograph. Further research turned up a list of names of Confederate soldiers that allegedly died in the Harper's care. The problem is with this list of names of soldiers is it arrived in the Goldsboro Argus newspaper at least third hand. So it's almost like somebody played a game of telephone with these guys' names. We weren't able to prove that some of those soldiers actually existed. We were able to prove that, at least in one case, that one of the soldiers did exist, but he lived until 1914. So he's obviously not buried here at Bentonville. So eventually, if we wanted to mark these graves, we were going to have to put unknown Confederate soldier on those grave markers. The problem with this is the federal government would not pay for grave markers for Civil War soldiers where the name is listed as unknown. You had to prove that a soldier existed and that he did not already have a marker. since we had no way of knowing who was buried in each plot. Even if the list of names was completely accurate, we were going to have to put unknown on the grave marker. But fortunately for us, the Harper House chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy stepped in and funded these markers. And you can see them being installed here in 2011. And here's the ceremony where this cemetery was dedicated. And reenactors from both sides firing a salute. So, where is this mass grave? As you likely suspect, it was going to be too difficult for the Goldsboro Rifles to find unmarked Confederates on a 6,000-acre battlefield 30 years after the fact. But the Harper family could easily identify exactly where 20 were buried. The Rifles likely gussied up this existing cemetery and possibly moved a couple other easily identifiable remains to this area. But the monument itself was ordered before a survey was made on the feasibility of reinterring all of these CS dead. And so the monument already says 360 Confederate soldiers, and it has these names on it, and that was literally carved in stone. Argument can be made that the Rifles meant for the 360 to mean the entire battlefield itself. But as we discussed earlier, fewer than 360 Confederates died outright anyways. And I do not think that the Rifles had that much forethought. I think that they truly intended on finding most of these Confederate dead, but then only allowing 2 weeks. And even then, if they had allowed 2 years, they'd never been able to find them all. But if the 360 on the monument implies the right here, even if they meant the battlefield itself, all the better in the eyes of the Goldsboro Rifles. But what is definitely true is that the entire battlefield still remains a cemetery to this day. Thank you for listening to my presentation.